The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep, open-minded conversation. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have Bill Konkolesky, State Director of Michigan MUFON, here to discuss the UFO phenomenon in our home state. From historical cases to modern-day investigations, the Mid-State has no shortage of bizarre sightings and encounters, and I was lucky enough today to finally have someone to cover it. But before we get into this fascinating episode today, we of course just have a little bit of news and updates. First and foremost, like I've mentioned on the last few episodes, the next live episode of Bizarre Inquiries will be on September 4th at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And there will be information posted on social media as we get a bit closer, of course. And if anybody has any questions, clips, articles, anything they would like to submit for that episode, just make sure you guys get it to us before then. And the t-shirt giveaway / survey is still going on. We are currently at 13 entries. I want to run that up to 50 before I do the random poll and give you guys a free t-shirt out of that. But all you guys have to do to enter is fill out a quick 8-question survey, all your guys' own thoughts and opinions that all go towards the show, and hopefully helping it grow and improve. And at the end of that, one lucky winner will have their number selected, and you guys will be able to pick any t-shirt of your choice off of the Open Minds Media merch store. It should only take you a couple minutes to fill out that survey, and I do really appreciate it if you guys don't mind taking the time to do it. And on the other side, if you guys might be interested in supporting the show, there are a handful of different ways you guys can do so. First and foremost, if you're not already following the show on social media, make sure you guys go and follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. You guys can also go and check out the Patreon with 2 tiers available, ad-free / early access and full access. And of course, with that full access, you guys will have access to these 0.5 episodes that I've been putting out lately. And you guys can also go and check out the merch store. A lot of awesome designs over there that I don't feel like I promote enough, but I think you guys will really enjoy them if you guys enjoy the show. So hopefully you guys don't mind taking a minute to go and check them out. T-shirts are starting at just $15.68 plus shipping, so not too bad as far as price range goes. And if you guys get a couple, of course, then the shipping ends up staying the same, so definitely worth it. And you guys can also leave a review for the show on any podcatcher you happen to use. And of course, if you guys do that, I will read it on the show and give you guys a big shout out. And if you know anybody that would really enjoy this particular episode or the show as a whole, you guys could always share the show with a friend and give you guys something else to talk about, maybe even something to talk about with your group of friends at work. You guys can all start listening to the podcast possibly. And if you guys enjoy catching the show live, you guys can make sure that you guys catch the show on the OMM YouTube and Twitch channels. We end up doing shows a good handful of nights each week. So if you guys follow on social media, you guys will get the notifications on when we are doing that, or if you guys follow either of the channels. And if you guys want to donate to the show directly to possibly, get me a coffee, get me an energy drink to stay up, to be able to edit this stuff for you guys, anything you guys do, greatly appreciate. You guys can also go and check out the affiliate links with some additional discounts and credits available down there for you guys. And the last way you guys can support the show and all the work that I do is by also going and checking out my other show, Bizarre Encounters with Shayn Orin. Been doing a lot of really awesome episodes over there. I think you guys will really enjoy it, and might even give you an additional show to get you guys through your work week. And every single thing that I mentioned is all available on the link tree, which is available down in the show description. And just one last thing before we get in the show. If anyone is interested in being a guest on the show, sharing their experiences or encounters, or contacting me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can call or text the Open Minds Media hotline. That number is 313-364-1551, and you guys can call or text that 24/7, and if you happen to miss that, it is available down in the show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome to the show, Bill Konkolesky, Michigan MUFON State Director. How's it going today, man?
Supersonic. And yourself?
Not doing too bad. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. You're one of the weird ones out that rather than, connecting through means through the internet, which inevitably ended up happening. Like I was mentioning before the show, I, take my kids to the local library all the time. And I noticed that there's a sign up on the wall that said UFOs over Michigan. And I ended up figuring out the name underneath it and figured, maybe I should hit up somebody that's in the local area to be able to talk about some of this weird stuff going on.
Sure thing. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So for anybody that may not be familiar with who you are, what you do, and for any of the listeners that haven't been paying attention and don't know what MUFON is, why don't you fill them in a little bit on who you are and what exactly you do?
Hey, yeah, I'm Bill Konkolesky. Like I mentioned, I've been State Director of Michigan MUFON since 2004, which I think actually may be a record now for anybody in a role like this within MUFON. MUFON stands for Mutual UFO Network. We're the world's largest civilian UFO research organization. We've been around since 1969. I have not been around since 1969, but I've been a member since 93. And like I said, in that current role since, for just over 20 years now. And, what we do, of course, people report their UFO sightings to us, generally through MUFON.com, and we always have an actual investigator look into every single case that we get and try to see if we can figure out what's going on. In Michigan, we get about 200 a year, just reported to MUFON a lot.
And just out of curiosity, what exactly got you into this? Did you have any personal experiences as a kid, or were you just kind of interested in the topic? What kind of led you down the path into eventually becoming part of MUFON?
Okay, so what led me to MUFON directly is maybe not. I've seen some weird things through my life, that's for sure. But the thing that led me to MUFON directly is I was a high school senior, and me and two buddies were in his car, and we were parked in front of another friend's house. This was in Sterling Heights. It was February at 9 p.m. It was dark out while the three of us were sitting in a car waiting for our friend to get home from work. And about the height of two telephone poles above us, there was a blue ball of light about the size of a car, and just glowing blue slowly flew over the car until we couldn't see it anymore. And then a white ball of light came and zigzagged all over the sky. And then a red ball after that disappeared, a red ball of light came and in the middle of the sky, grew to about the size of a full moon, which is quite large, and then shrank and disappeared. And so all three of us saw it exactly the same way. One of my friends says, hey, maybe we should report this to the police. I'm like, well, we're all high school seniors. Let's tell the police that we saw a UFO. That'll be helpful. And then my other friend says, well, maybe then we should tell Selfridge Air National Guard Base, which is right nearby. And so I'm like, okay, so you're not going to tell the police, but you want to tell the military? And so we didn't tell anybody. We didn't know who to tell. And in fact, the next day I found an additional witness at my work who told me their story before I told mine, so I knew it was the same thing. And then when I got into college, a friend of mine says, she's like, there's a place called the Center for UFO Studies, and that's in Chicago. And she's like, next time you're in Chicago, maybe you could tell them your story. So I did. And when I went there, I spoke to a guy, Dr. Mark Rodiger, who, when I told him my story, he replied, by asking, have I told my state MUFON chapter? And I said, MUFON, what's that? And so then he directed me to the state director of Michigan MUFON at the time, a woman by the name of Shirley Coyne, And then when I heard my story, then I thought it was a great reception that I received for telling a kind of a crazy story. And so then afterwards, I was like, can I stick around? So that's how I got into MUFON in '93. So again, not the craziest thing that I've seen. And so there's definitely a couple directions I could see that we could go from a point like this, either talking about big Michigan sightings or some of the weird stuff that I saw, if you had a preference.
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to the show. Oh, I definitely love to get into, honestly, both. Definitely the weird things that you've seen. And just to kind of add into what you were mentioning, because it's a little bit south of Sterling Heights, one of the things that actually led me into kind of diving into a lot of this stuff for the podcast was back in, I believe it was about 2014, I was in the Myers parking lot at 13 in Little Mac, and I'm sure you're familiar with that area in Roseville. And we were parked and we were looking up in the sky. My girlfriend and I were there, and we saw these probably like 5 or 6 of these red little like orbs that were moving around the sky, and they all kind of went into this like triangular position, and then they all kind of sporadically started moving in different directions, and then all just kind of vastly like took off. And I didn't think anything of it for a while. It was just kind of one of those things that I just kind of left in the back of my mind, like, I don't know, maybe it was just something weird. And then weirdly enough, about a year and a half ago, I'm at work, and this other guy is talking about this weird UFO experience he had, and he was talking about seeing basically the same thing that I'd seen. And I asked him where he was exactly, and he said he was at his mom's house, which was at about 12 and Little Mac. So I realized, and I asked him about what time zone it was, and he said it was about the same time that I'd seen it. So then I started adding a little bit more validity into maybe some of these like red orb UFOs above Michigan, which kind of leads me into my point. You'd mentioned that you'd seen some of these red orbs. At least from like your research and from stuff around Michigan, do these seem to be something that's seen semi-regularly? And if so, what seems to kind of be your understanding of the significance of these red ones in particular?
Well, I don't know if there's color classification that's meaningful, though people do see a number of different lights in the sky, which could have, I'll just say it up front, some prosaic explanations. Anything from planes to drones to Chinese lanterns to a variety of other things in the sky that might be causing lights to appear there. But in terms of what, it's all really based upon the behavior of it, I think, that makes it interesting. If somebody says they saw a red ball of light move across the sky in a single direction, there may not be a lot to go on there. But if someone says, then suddenly it took a right turn, and then, did a spiral, something like that, and now you know that you really have something interesting. But I don't know, like I said, in terms of color classification, but people definitely see, when they say they see lights in the sky and they're doing fantastic things, that's definitely an attention getter.
And especially with Selfridge being so close, I mean, anybody in the area kind of chalks up anything that's kind of weird in the sky towards Selfridge, especially considering that if you're, from the area, you're constantly just seeing different planes flying in different circles around the area. So at first I was kind of chalking it up to possibly being, some type of technology, especially in 2014. It's not like drones were as prevalent, but like I mentioned, the weird part was there was about 5 or 6 of them, and they all kind of went into this triangular pattern, and then they all kind of shot off in different directions into different areas in the sky. And that's why I was like, maybe some kind of lights, maybe some type of lasers. But the fact that somebody else saw it from a different location, I don't know, added something a little bit weird to it. But I feel like Michigan is one of those places that not a lot of people, associate it with a lot of UFO stuff. But if I'm not mistaken, aren't we actually one of the top states as far as like UFO sightings go?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Just within MUFON alone, Michigan's always within the top 10 of ranks for sightings. And, with the relative size of other states, for Michigan to be holding that top 10 position persistently, I think is meaningful. Why Michigan? I'm not quite sure. But going through just modern history, like starting in 1953, we had the Kinross incident over Lake Superior, and there's a number of other things since then, but I'm just touching on Kinross for an instant. This was a situation where the Kinross Air Force Base up in the UP tracked a very reflective large object hovering over the Sioux Locks. They scrambled an F-89 Scorpion jet to check into it, and then the unknown object on the radar shot out over Lake Superior at a speed of about 500 miles an hour, and the jet pursued it with the two pilots on board, and they lost radio contact with the pilots, and then they watched as the jet got closer and closer and closer on the radar until at one point they intersected, and then both disappeared forever. They never found the plane, no idea what happened to the pilots. Certainly, Lake Superior has been trolled for the wreckage for a long time, but now it's 70 years plus since the event happened, and they still don't know what happened to the plane. The big thing that happened in Michigan was 1966. The most famous thing that happened, sorts of different sightings, well over 1,000 witnesses. It really sort of started in 65, went to 67. 66 was a big year for UFOs across the country. But here in Michigan, some of the big things, like on March 14th of 1966, over the campus of University of Michigan, there were over 100 witnesses from the window of like about 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. of different colored lights doing fantastic maneuver over the campus. A few days later, people saw in Dexter, Michigan, a formation of 5 of these lights flying over, and then one of the lights descended, and actually it was a flying saucer. It landed in a field near a family's home, and it was witnessed by 2 members of the family as well as a couple police officers. And then the very next night after that, that was March 20th, and on the 21st, over Hillsdale College, there was a UFO sighted. In fact, 89 witnesses went on to see a UFO landed in the ball field there on campus. And so there was a lot of activity. J. Allen Hynek from Project Blue Book came in, wanted to be dismissive of it, at least publicly, even if he privately believed that something had happened. And so he had dismissed it very famously as swamp gas. So if you ever hear that UFOs are nothing but swamp gas, it's because of that event that day in 1966. And after he made that claim, everybody was in an uproar. Like, what I saw wasn't swamp gas. This wasn't marsh gas. And Gerald Ford, who was a congressman at the time, actually wrote a letter to the Armed Services Committee saying that there should be a open hearing on UFOs. And just a few days later, there actually was one. And J. Allen Hynek testified, and it was a real big to-do. One could go into that story talking about it for probably easily an hour or more, of all the different things that had happened back in 1966. And anytime I do a talk on UFOs anywhere, there's always somebody in the audience that remembers that directly remembers that particular event. I suppose as time goes on, not be as many, but there's always still witnesses around for that. 1975, UFOs descended over 4 different air bases over the course of about 2 weeks, lowering Wordsmith here in Michigan, and then Melmstrom and Minot Air Force bases as well. And this all happened about a 2-week period at the end of October and beginning of November. And so we had a base in Michigan up until that was decommissioned in 93. But on October 30th, 1975, the night of this event, a big bright light came down over the base, and they had a plane sort of approach it, the object flew off and the plane went after it until it couldn't keep up with it any longer. And then, yeah, very similar things at the other 3 Air Force bases at the time that also had nuclear weapons. And then in 1994 was, to me, a big and important event. I had joined MUFON in late 93. And then on March 8th, 1994, in the Grand Rapids area, there were over 300 witnesses that night to UFOs. And over 60 people actually called 911 about the UFOs. They call if there's an intruder in your house or you've fallen in, you can't get out. People were calling 911 to say they saw a UFO. They were that impressed with it. And there was one family that saw a giant silver disc that night for hovering over the neighbor's house. The police showed up and also witnessed it. In Muskegon, the National Weather Service observed it as well and tracked it. The radar operator, Jack Bushong, said that the objects flew from the Grand Rapids, Holland, Muskegon, Grand Haven area out over to Lake Michigan at a speed he estimates as 72,000 miles an hour. And so that was a big night as well. And there was an Unsolved Mysteries book, and it's in the 3rd season. The episode's called Something in the Sky. And if somebody wants to check out that episode, it's a really great documentation of that particular night. And I was glad to have a big hand in putting that one together because it came out so well. A lot of UFO TV is regrettable, but every once in a while you get a diamond like this. It's well worth seeing. So there's some of the big ones. If you go back to the late 1890s, Michigan was part of the airship flap where people were seeing things that looked like blimps, but were traveling much faster than that. And really airships weren't a thing back then over here. I mean, balloons had been around since well before them, but the type of things that people were reporting, nobody had invented, created, were running across the United States at that time.
Say that was actually something that I recently covered on my other show, Bizarre Encounters, that my co-host Orin dived into it, but he dived into it from, I don't actually think he actually ever ended up touching Michigan with any of the airship stuff, but I mean, some of like the weird reportings that people were citing with that stuff, that was like multiple things all happening at once. There was like bright lights that were moving that clearly weren't like fire. And one thing that, a lot of people throw in with those airship things is, unidentified, just like flying things that people are aware of now, such as like hot air balloons or maybe some very, very early attempts at flight possibly. But, it's really, really easy to throw it offhand when you kind of just initially first start hearing the details. But when you start really, really diving into it and you start diving into even some of the weird sightings that people had as far as like these like humanoid looking things that look like they were wearing suits and everything, but they didn't quite look human. Like, it gets kind of weird, and you kind of throw out the idea that it was probably just air balloons pretty quickly once you really start getting into it. But if you have any interesting particular cases from Michigan, I'd love to hear it.
And they would come down on anchors, and they would ask for water and weird things like that, back during that 1890s slap.
Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. And now back to the show.
One of the sightings, so there's a couple of them that come to mind in terms of cases that I personally looked into, and one of them, it was March of 2005. I got a phone call from somebody, and I could hear the trembling in his voice. When you are an investigator and you do enough sighting reports, you can often tell within the first few seconds some of the broad details of it. Like, just very basically, if they're excited about what they saw, that means it wasn't very close. If they were enthused about it, I should say, but if they were trembling, that means that, something unfortunate affected them. So this guy said he had 2 sighting reports. They were both in September, so he had waited 6 months to call. And one was on September, it was like the 29th and the 30th of September. So with roughly 6 months had passed since he called. And so he invited me over to talk about it. And first night, he was driving, this was Highland, Michigan. He was driving on a road. It was fairly narrow, had tall trees on either side. It was kind of a windy road. And as he turned around a bend, he suddenly found himself underneath, said, a giant triangle. And when I asked him what he meant by giant, he said it was about the size of a football stadium. And so, and it's not unusual for people to report really big things like that. I actually had somebody say that they saw something that filled the entire sky over Berkeley once. So anyway, so he said that the craft it was a giant black triangle, completely still, making no noise whatsoever, had white lights at the vertices, a red light directly in the center below it, and that it it basically was solid, he said he knew, because he could see that he blocked out the stars, and he wanted no part of it, and he just floored it, went home, and he said he had a panic attack. The next day, he's at his home, and he's lying in bed. He's taking an afternoon nap about 3 o'clock, and he looks out the window of his second floor bedroom, and he sees what looks like, at first, a car driving over the tops of the trees. And he's like, well, that's weird. So he looks closer, and he's like, okay, there's no tires on this thing. It's got these little portholes on it. It's black. It's about the size of a car, moving about the speed of a car, but it's not a car. So he watches it till he can't see it any longer. And then he said he sat down on the bed and collected himself again. And he's still recovering from what he saw the night before. So then he eventually gets up, walks downstairs into his kitchen area, and there it is, parked in his backyard. So I asked him, the basic questions. Did you take a picture of it? And he's like, no, I didn't want it to think I had a weapon. Did you call anyone? And he's like, well, he goes, it probably could hear my transmissions, and if it saw me or whatever, said he knew that it would take that as I was calling in for reinforcements, which is actually accurate. And so he's like, I didn't want to do anything to be perceived as a threat. So I'm like, okay, so what did you do? And he said, I sat on the couch and watched it for an hour. And then after an hour, the ship got up, levitated, and then flew through the trees, slowly through the trees, and disappeared. And so I'm like, okay, it's only been about 6 months. If there's any depressions in the ground, they're probably still there. If there's any sort of energy readings, that's probably too late for that. But let's see if there's any. Let's see if this is if there's any depressions in the ground. So but when I looked out the window, there was about 2 feet of snow. It was early March, and we still had snow on the ground that year. So I said to the guy, well, I could come back in a couple months and maybe take a look at this when the snow is melted. And he's like, nope. He's like, I'm giving this to you. I am no longer going to think about this. This is your problem now. It was like he was exorcising it from his psyche and dumping it on us. He didn't want any part of it anymore. It was giving him tremendous anxiety, and now it was our problem. So then I said, okay, I respected his wishes, and he actually passed away even a year later, so there wasn't any chance of him changing his mind about anything. But at a MUFON meeting just a few years later, in 2008, a truck driver came in. We would meet locally in the Flint area at that time. Now, when we meet, it's primarily in Frankenmuth, but we have other meetings that we do. And so anyway, so this guy comes in with these sketches of something he saw when he was driving his truck in Oklahoma. It was 3 a.m., and he was on an expressway, and he showed me the sketch, and it was exactly the same thing as what that other witness had reported landed in his backyard. It was black, wedge-shaped, had 3 portholes, and he said, as he had to follow the route of the expressway that he was on, this object instead just continued on its straight path while the expressway veered off, and that's how he lost sight of it. But I was like, I just got goosebumps because it was exactly the same thing that the other person had reported. And so one of the other things that I thought was a really good case was this happened, I think this was 2007, if I remember correct. Somebody called and left a lengthy voicemail message for me. And it was at a time where I was getting a new cell phone, and I had mistakenly thought that I had lost that message when I got the new phone. But it turns out I had downloaded it and forgot that I had downloaded it. And so I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to be able to call this guy back. And then I found the message, and so I listened to it again. 6 months later, I realized I still had his message. And I called him. I said, this is kind of late, 6 months later, but I told him what happened. And then he repeated his story word for word exactly as he reported it to me initially. So I knew that, here I am calling from out of the blue, and yet he still hit the story note for note exactly as he originally told it. And his story was he was driving up US 23 towards Ann Arbor. It was about 8 a.m, and him and his wife carpooled to work. And as they were driving up, they saw this little glint in the sky. And as they drove closer, they made out the shape. It was a pyramid. And they said there was a pyramid as they got closer, a silver pyramid that was so large that it covered both north and southbound lanes of traffic and was covered in some kind of hieroglyphics. And so he pulled over, and the guy was very credible in his delivery about this. There was nothing suspicious in his telling of the story of this really fantastic thing he saw. So him and his wife pull over to the road, and there were other people pulled over on the side of the road as well. But strangely, not everybody was pulled over. I mean, you see this giant friggin' pyramid over the expressway, and people are still just on their way to work, like as if nothing's going on. So as they're watching it, and there's been a lot of reported cases where some people just don't see it. It harkens back to that old story about the, when the Westerners came over to the Americas, the indigenous people didn't see the ships coming because they didn't have a way to process it. And so they just didn't even see them, that sort of story. So while they're watching it, there was also a police officer there, and he claimed that somebody had made a police report. I was unable to track that down. And while they were watching, beneath the pyramid now, they're close enough to see beneath it, it had a black surface below it and 2 white lights underneath it. And the thing was completely still, hovering, no noise or whatever. And as they're watching, then, though, it just turns just a little bit. And then everyone's like, oh my gosh, it's moving. And then it starts spinning and spins faster and faster and faster. And then shoots off at this remarkable speed, literally seconds before 2 jet fighters flew over. And so I was like, wow, that's an incredible story. And, I asked, if he had any others, and he's like, no, that was my only thing. He's like, my wife saw it, I saw it, other people saw it. And, it didn't really seem like he was trying to hoax me. And the fact that, like I said, every single detail he came out with, not expecting me to wait 6 months to call him, obviously. And so that really impressed me for that. And you know, that there should be such a massive, such a bizarre sighting to have happened, and yet everybody doesn't know about it. It is really strange to me. Now, I gotta admit that today, I think half the people would have their cell phones out filming it, probably, if it happened today. But back then, I mean, people had cell phones in 2007. It certainly wasn't rare, but I'm not sure about the camera power that they would have been working with. But yeah, but oddly enough, no pictures of it, nothing, just a story.
Say, I don't know if you have come across any of these cases, at least from like Michigan stuff, but it seems like with a lot of the UFO stuff, there's either spare the moment that somebody just happens to see something because they happen to be looking up in the sky, or the other part of the phenomenon is that there seems to be these UFOs that have an interest in like particular people or particular family lines. And it seems like with maybe some of these cases and with even some of the other people I've talked to where it seems like they have an interest in their family line, it'll be something weird where like certain people will see it, like their family line will see it, but they have like friends over or something, for example, they just like won't see it for whatever reason. And you kind of brought up the idea of it not being like within somebody's like paradigm, so their brain kind of just washes over it. But I've often wondered if like these things have such advanced technology, if they do have a particular interest in a particular person, I mean, would it be out of the question to assume that maybe these things have the ability to cloak themselves to some but not others possibly? And maybe that could have been what happened in this case, was that only a few people weren't able to kind of see past this things like cloak or facade, maybe because they had some type of family link or lineage or something to these things, possibly, even maybe without them even being aware, possibly.
Sure. Yeah, certainly possible. What you learn in the community is that the people that are most certain about how UFOs operate are usually just making stuff up. So to keep an open mind about what could be happening is the only way to do it. To embrace the mystery, and that makes as much sense as anything that could be said. Well, I don't know if there's any quantifiable evidence for how a thing like that could happen. I mean, that does make logical sense. Absolutely.
I definitely agree with you there. It's one thing I say all the time on the show when it comes to any of these topics, be it Bigfoot, UFOs, the paranormal. If anybody has any for sure definite answers, then, there's probably something behind that answer. You have to kind of throw a bunch of stuff at the wall to hopefully come up eventually with something that makes sense when it comes to this stuff. But hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to that deep conversation you crave. I guess with that, kind of talking about it, I always like to ask people that dive into ufology, what exactly like their view is on these things. Like what kind of paradigm do you at least put it in? Just, again, I know nobody knows the answers, but at least with your current research, like what do you think these things are exactly?
Okay, so there's this thing that I used to say, and I still say, but there was a ufologist by the name of Paula Harris, and she said the same thing that I'd been saying for a long time. There's sort of an all of the above, I think, aspect to this. If someone says, are they from another planet? Sure. Are they from another dimension? Sometimes. Are they from another time? Yeah, why not? And there's ample evidence that anywhere that anybody thinks it's any sort of novel origin that these visitors could have, there's enough evidence to support it. But what there isn't is things that make it mutually exclusive. Because they're time travelers doesn't mean that there's not beings from another dimension. Both could absolutely both be true. And for me, my perspective, and something that I didn't necessarily lead with, while that UFO sighting that I mentioned was the thing that moved on, my very first memory in life is a little gray guy coming up to my crib with the giant eyes. And I had, that was age 2. And I had another experience with them at age 4, 7. I got a scar on my arm from that one. 9, 10, several times in my teens and going into my early 20s as well. So I've been a frequent flyer. And from my perspective, I get a conflicted sort of potential background from them, because some of the things that have happened to me are physical. Some of the things were clearly not physical, but very real. And so there's sort of a background for a physical origin and also, say, an interdimensional origin as well. And maybe these things flit in and out of physicality. I don't know. And I think that if you've met enough people, as it sounds like, the people that have these things happen to them aren't necessarily the ones with answers. And the people with answers usually don't have the correct answers. So it's still a big mystery. And when I talk about Michigan UFO history in library presentations, like UFOs over Michigan, I often lead with, the Milky Way galaxy has about 300 billion stars, give or take. And what NASA is currently projecting is that about maybe 1 in 6 stars has a potentially habitable world, or a planet or a moon by the current estimates. And some say that estimate is about to tick up. But if it's just 6, even, let's say, that means you divide 300 billion by 6, and you get 50 billion potentially habitable worlds just in the Milky Way. And with there being 2 trillion galaxies out there is the current estimation, and let's say that the Milky Way is average, then that's 100 sextillion potentially habitable worlds out there.
Say, especially considering that who knows how possibly advanced these things could be, ahead of us, or even stuff that's way behind us. I mean, that's something I always take into consideration, is that it seems like, to me, it's a lot more plausible that there's something out there than there's not anything that exists out there at all. And just like you kind of brought up, I kind of entertain that there's multiple different answers to what this phenomenon could be. I take into consideration, the fact that these things could be coming from somewhere else. It seems like the really, really popular theory that a lot of people like to throw around now is that these things are coming from under the surface, be it from under the water or coming from cave systems. And they've kind of used these explanations with the grays, kind of alluding that they're kind of like these cave dweller types. I mean, in even the other kind of phenomenon that I've been kind of tossing at the wall lately that I find kind of interesting, and I'm assuming a lot of people that are into this UFO stuff are probably fans of the old Star Trek. And they talk about these species that, they exist on a planet, and then they get to this point where they evolve past being a physical version of themselves anymore. And then once they become this non-physical energy version of themselves, they can still like manifest like physical versions of themselves, but that's not their definite form. So it seems like to me, everybody's kind of throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, but, everybody talks about this idea about like elevating consciousness, like things becoming advanced, like moving beyond like physical beings. And I don't know, I feel like that there could be a lot of good validity to that as far as this UFO phenomenon goes. And that could explain why there seems to be this physical and this also almost like spiritual or like conscious aspect to it, where people get like pulled out of their body, for example. But it's it's one of those really, really hard things to fully like place your thumb on, because there's just so much going on. And of course, on top of that, you have to take into consideration that there's probably some human intervention going on with this. And I actually did a full series on it, trying to connect some pieces with stuff, basically saying that I think that there's definitely a phenomenon happening, but behind this phenomenon, when flaps are happening, if the U.S. government has new ships they want to test out, they have possibly some human experiments they want to test out, of course, fly under the radar and just kind of use the initial flap as something where everything's going to be UFOs after that. But yeah, it's such a hard thing to such a hard thing to research, because there's so many different angles you could go with it. And like you said, there's so many different connecting pieces that all these theories kind of make sense in their own way.
And it's weird to say this is a problem, but there's so many UFO sightings now collected that anybody with a confirmation bias can support any theory that they want. And so, that certainly does make it down. And there have been times when I've ruminated about it where, I absolutely agree with your point with that. I think that is a point of evolution of any given species. Their technology gets advanced enough so that they could pop consciousness out of a physical form and put it into another physical form. And if they can do that, they can exist in a non-physical form natively. And so therefore, what then differentiates them from ghosts or other sort of spiritual things. And so that, is definitely, I think, a possibility. Many people, I know, I say that, which also includes myself, wonder if, during these abduction events, if their lack of respect for our beings is that they don't see bodies as themselves. They see bodies as a vehicle where we completely integrate our physical self as ourself. And so when they're messing with our bodies, we're like, what are you doing to me? And they're like, no, we're not doing anything to you. We're just messing with this vehicle you've been dorking around in for the last few decades. So I think that is probably a big sort of divide in the way that people see what's happening to them. I will say, and this is always tricky water to sort of wade into, that so once upon a time, people refer to people who had this sort of contact as a contactee, and then that really got a bad name because while people were reporting things that had validly happened to them, they were very clearly shucksters who were just making anything up to get their book out. And then when the reboot button was hit in the 80s, when the term abductee was in vogue, 80s and to the 90s, and people were talking about being abducted by aliens, and it necessarily wasn't a positive thing, and they didn't have the answers. They weren't coming out and saying Jesus took them to Venus. They were saying these weird things took me. I have no idea what happened. I'm just telling you what I remember. And then after that, the evolution of the term was that people thought abductee was a very victim-laden term for what was going on. And not everyone was taken. Not everyone felt they had a negative experience. And there is sort of obviously a negative connotation with the term abductee. So then when experiencer came into vogue, it was like, okay, this is a nice sort of way to talk about the phenomena without just leading in with an ugly term like abductee. Where the complication started was when people who were having physical encounters, who called themselves experiencers, were now meeting other people who were channelers or transmediums, and they were saying that they were channeling extraterrestrial beings, and these people didn't have the same sort of physical, structured, regimented life of being repeatedly taken by these beings, mostly seemingly for physical purposes. But these channelers were like, oh, we're both experiencers. Isn't that great? Where the two phenomena are wildly different at times. And so when somebody says, oh, I'm an experiencer. Oh, I'm an experiencer too. I channeled the Galactic Council. I'm like, well, that's nice. I was sexually assaulted. So are we really talking about the same thing? So I find that the challenge that the community has now is that experiencer has become overgeneralized as a term. And now it can mean anything from, having your arm taken off, like a experiencer abductee, Eric Nansteel, talks about, all the way to someone saying, when I was 16, I had a very real dream about an owl. I'm an experiencer too. And so I don't fault any particular lane of this phenomena. I'm not saying anything is better than the other, but I think that there is way, hopefully, for better recognition of people saying, you had an experience. I'll say it's valid. You say it's valid, but it's not the same experience that I had. So the same terminology might not apply to each of our experiences that are unique to each other. judgments about the other person's experiences may not be as meaningful because we haven't experienced the same type of thing. And so I think some clarity is the challenge at the moment, because now that experiencer seems to mean anything to anybody. That those people who have had a rough ride through their lives and are talking about something distinctly physical, they still need a platform. And it's there's, especially with the internet now, everything is out there all the time. And whenever you look up the phenomena, you're spinning a roulette wheel on what website or what Facebook page or what group you land in, and what their perception is of phenomena that universally deals something with space, but is not the same phenomena that other people are encountering as well.
No, I definitely agree with you. Because I've had, honestly, both sides of it. I've had people that have come on and talked about, like, just channeling, contacting, even weirdly enough, some people using EVP and having alien contact. And then on the flip side, you have people that are, like, diehard physical experiencers. They've had these super duper traumatic events. And I agree, there needs to be some type of, like, a separation as far as terminology goes. Maybe, like, abductee specifically, people have had, like, the physical contact with them, where, like, contactee would be somebody who's been in, like, mental or connecting contact, or use that as like a general term or something like that. Because yeah, like you said, it's hard to just throw all of these types of experiences or people in the same bag, because it's just so vastly different, especially even the way that people talk about these things. The people that are having these like mental communications, they're a lot more uplifting about how they talk and contact these things, where it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to the people that are hard contactees, that they either had this really, really traumatic experience, or they maybe on the flip side had this experience where something possibly got fixed, and they come back and they have this like totally life-changing experience. And I mean, even that, I guess, is probably a matter of perspective, because one kind of thing that I've kind of thrown and kind of believe is possible when it comes to this stuff, as far as abductions go, is that it's almost, I know a lot of people have used this analogy, but it's like the equivalent of like when we tag animals out in the wild, that will, pick up some animals, maybe put a tag in them, help them out with something possibly, and then kind of throw them back to just be able to observe them. And I think that could definitely be possible if these things are significantly more advanced and you're entertaining the possibility of them coming from somewhere else, that they have an interest in watching us and just kind of viewing us as, I guess, like an animal, so to speak, because at that point, if they're significantly more advanced than us, I don't really see the trading back and forth idea, unless that's maybe a totally different species maybe that we're talking about. But, talking about these bagging and tagging, for lack of a better term, experiences, I mean, it's all about, the perspective of the person that's going through the experience. Because if you're getting, just imagine it like a fish. If it gets pulled out of the wild, and even if you're trying to help it, it doesn't understand the experience, it's freaking out, it's going to have an awful experience. But every once in a while, you'll have that calm fish that you'll be able to put the tag in and drop it back in, and it's just back on its merry way and doesn't even acknowledge what even happened to it. So yeah, definitely need some type of hard separation between the two. Getting back full circle with that one, but Inquiries About Reality will return after this quick commercial break. And we are back, so let's hop right in. Is also to bring it up, because we were talking about contactees and abductees. As far as like Michigan goes, has there been any cases that have stood out to you as far as like contactees or abductees, to try to be a little bit more specific? And also, as an extension to that, does it seem like there's a specific type of extraterrestrial race that people have contact with in Michigan when they do have these abductee experiences?
I think Michigan's as diverse as anywhere else with regards to the types of beings that are being experienced. It's the Greys really have a wide number of sightings and encounters people have with different types of beings. But yeah, I know I hear reptilians as well as mantids, and also the Nordics, the big ones. And for, in my personal experience, I had experience with little Greys, bigger Greys, the mantises, possibly some type of hybrid, but not necessarily anything I'd consider Nordic or reptilian. I do have a funny story that these friends of mine Both were experiencers, so use that term, abductees, whatever, and they were dating. They met as part of the abduction community, and they started dating. The guy, his beings were grays, and the girl were reptilians. And one night, they're at his place and in bed, and he wakes up and he sees both the grays and these reptilians at the foot of his bed, and they were kind of looking at each other like, oh geez, we both showed up on the same night. It was like, oops, we didn't check each other's calendars. And so he's just watching, and they're there, and you could tell that there was sort of an awkwardness, a tension between them, that they clearly were not part of the same group, and then from his perspective, they both vanished. And I really enjoyed that story, that he said that was the case.
Just out of curiosity, have you come across any other like reptilian stuff in Michigan? And also, just as an extension to that, I know everybody kind of has their different ideas on like what exactly the reptilians are, because it's been kind of thrown around in a bunch of different conspiracy circles. So also, just to specify, like, what is like your idea of like a reptilian too?
So first of all, my favorite theory, and it's all theories, my favorite theory, to me, the thing that would tend to make sense, is that due to the high number of grays, and the fact that grays seem to be working in concert with whatever species else is out there. A lot of people say, hey, I saw a gray with a mantis, I saw a gray with a reptilian, blah, blah, blah. I think that there is some sort of overarching species that goes around the galaxy, we'll say, just to use one almost meaningless construct, because it could be many galaxies, I don't know. But anyway, so there's this overarching species that finds other sentient species out there and brings them into their fold. So I think that, my favorite theory that seems to make the most sense out of the most stories that I've heard of reptilians is that whatever the Greys came to their planet and said, hey, there's something we can do with the DNA of these lizards here. And then therefore the reptile folk are, just part of the bigger group. And most of the time I hear they're aggressive. They can be even violent, difficult. And then every once in a while, I'll hear a story. There's this one woman that told me that one was romantically interested in her, but very respectful. And I've heard variations on that as well. So, I mean, there's it goes back to any theory that anybody has. There's seemingly some sort of evidence for it. And not having that sort of experience myself, I only go by this theory.
I mean, I could definitely see some good validity to it, kind of like you said with any theory if you're looking for the right things. But it seems like particularly Greys have this interest in DNA and genetics, and they almost kind of seem like they're like a makeup of like multiple things, which is why a lot of people have like a hard time placing them. Where when it comes to these other races, like, the insectoids, the mantises, the reptilians, they seem like they're not necessarily like more purposeful, but they seem like they just have different interests other than like DNA. Like most of the time when people report the mantises, they're usually kind of watching from a distance. They seem like they're almost like these observing types, but it doesn't seem like there's like a lot of really like heavy interaction, where obviously the Greys, it's constantly this explanation of, are they doing something with DNA? They just have interest in particular people. And then the reptilians, they're kind of a mixed bag. You kind of, like you mentioned, you have the people that kind of refer to them as these like observers. You have other people that kind of refer to them as this like evil race that basically tries to control everything from the inside. And I mean, if you're kind of looking at it from like the broader perspective of the universe all kind of interconnecting, I mean, you could almost relate them almost to like the Klingons, so to speak, from Star Trek, that they're the little bit more aggressive ones with their own demeanor for things. But maybe it's just a matter of, it's not that they're necessarily evil. It's just that we don't have the right perspective to view whatever their initial purpose is, because I'm always trying to state this to people that we simply observe everything from the human perspective, but that doesn't mean that it's the broader perspective when it comes to any of this type of stuff. But the reason I ended up bringing up the Greys, or the reptilians in particular, was I don't know if it was exactly a reptilian or anything, but when I first ended up starting my podcast, I ended up having this really weird experience where I was out ranting about something in line once, and I had this lady that turned to me. She like pulled her mask down, she looked at me, and I saw this like almost like reptilian overlay over her face, and then she turned back and went to what she was doing. And that's kind of where I had this whole thing with like reptilians, that, you know, I think that they're for lack of a better term, not necessarily like hiding amongst us like how people think they are, like they're, you know, infiltrating the government and they're all these political figures and all these different things like that, but rather, you know, people don't understand what their purpose is. Like maybe it is more of an observing thing and they are kind of around us, but they're not interacting the same way as Greys are, because their intention is they kind of sit back and firsthand observe, where like the mantises kind of third person observe, so to speak.
Yeah, certainly. I know, hear all sorts of stories where people run into what appear to be beings among us trying to mask themselves, in this case, literally. And, so that there's some sort of evidence that there's an ongoing project that's very intimate in our society, that so things are watching us and trying to figure us out at, at the very basic level. And I'm sure when they're at home at night watching television, they're just completely baffled by us. You know?
It kind of makes you wonder if like what the interest is exactly. Like if it's us in particular, if it's the location in particular. But it seems like through time, for the most part, we've gotten pretty lucky when it comes to a lot of cataclysms, as far as like, you know, we talk about these different cultures that have existed before the current time, that, you know, the planet temporarily flooded, or there was these different disasters where everything moved to the other side of the planet, where, you know, maybe their interest is the fact that this planet hasn't been completely destroyed by any type of cataclysm. They see it as maybe it's off on some far corner of space or something, where they all kind of have an invested interest, where they can kind of have like a pocket and know that it's almost like a vault or like a safe, that for the most part, like this isn't a main impact site. Where it seems like with a lot of these things, maybe the inevitable reason why they end up leaving wherever they're from is because they get to a point where they know that there's going to be some type of disaster, and if they don't get off the planet, then, you know, there's not going to be them in the future. And a lot of people like to throw the theories that these things are literally coming from somewhere, but I've often wondered if it's not necessarily that they're coming from somewhere, but rather that they've just kind of adapted, so to speak, and learned to kind of exist and live in space, knowing that it's like the safest place to be, because if you're locked and stuck on a planet, then, you know, you're essentially at the will of any chaos that ends up coming your way. But, you know, it seems like it would almost kind of make more sense that these things have more of an interaction with us constantly if they honestly just don't have a place they return to. They kind of just exist around whatever planetary body they have an interest in at that current time.
Yeah, I forget what the terminology is for this, because I've heard a term for this, but the theory that these beings maybe came from an immense distance away, and when they got here, they just sort of set up a permanent camp and then went on their way to explore the rest of the galaxy while they're breeding and building their own sort of civilization in and around us, so that every time that somebody's visited, it's not necessarily somebody coming from across the galaxy or even the local star, that they have local bases here, maybe underwater or in caves, other side of the moon or whatever. And so that then they just report their findings to the great collective civilization. That, yeah, they're not anytime anybody sees a UFO, doesn't mean that it came from a great distance. It could have come from not very far away at all.
I mean, that's one of those things that you almost have to mirror how we would do things, where, you know, with a lot of this UFO stuff, I'm always saying that, you know, these Greys are more than likely probably some variation of a biological drone, because the way that we've already progressed as a society is that we're eventually going to get to a point with warfare where it's all drones, and then eventually it'll probably become something where it's a little bit more of a biological drone. So looking at the way that we kind of intend to do space travel, where they talk about, basically setting up colonies along the way. So you kind of have this dispersed spread of your species throughout the galaxy, and even kind of seeing it like throughout like even, different sci-fi things. Like it would make sense to mirror this over to these other species. Like, why do we take out the gap of thinking logically how you would step by step get to this point, and everybody just jumps to the, they left the surface of their planet and they came right here? Why does it seem like it's such a far out thing to assume that step by step they've created colonies and bases getting to these points? Like that almost seems a lot more logical and puts a little bit more life in the galaxy than, the idea that somebody's coming from a distant spot in the galaxy and using like a wormhole, for example. And then it's like a generational progression. It's not like, the first generation that left the planet made it to this point. It's generation and generation. You get into the whole thing in, sci-fi about generational ships, where they send somebody out on a mission knowing that it's not going to be till their grandkids' generation that they make it to whatever the destination or the location is.
Yeah, right on.
Hold on tight, guys. This is our last break, so stay tuned. And we are back to the show. Let's hop right in. But I guess kind of starting to wrap up, man, and this has been an awesome conversation, and I'm hoping that, at some point soon we could definitely dive back in, and considering that you're somewhat local, maybe even at some point we might be able to even podcast in person and have a one-on-one and be able to talk about some of this stuff. But
yeah, right on.
As far as today goes, man, I always like to end the show with some words of wisdom. So if there was any words of wisdom that you might want to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
So one of my favorite stories about exploring any sort of phenomena, UFOs, cryptids, ghosts, whatever, goes back to a gentleman by the name of Sir William Crookes, who was a physicist over 100 years ago, Nobel Prize winning. And he was a serious scientist, and yet he had a passion for seances. And he would attend seances, and he was very fascinated with the whole aspect of trying to contact the spirit world. But this was to the great embarrassment of the other scientific minds at that time, who were his colleagues. And there's this great quote that Sir William Crookes had when he was approached by one of his fellow scientists. And they said, "How come you're spending so much time, wasting so much time investigating this stuff when we all know that it's impossible?" And Crookes looks back at the guy and says, "I never said it was possible. I only said it was true." And so I always love that. I'm like, yes, right on. I totally feel that 100%.
It's a matter of getting there. I'm always throwing it on the show that sometimes these occult philosophies end up becoming a science with more understanding. And I'm always throwing alchemy eventually turned into chemistry. I think a lot of these like occult rituals are actually a master understanding of psychology. And it's just a matter of understanding. It seems like absolute magic, but once you get to a point where you've progressed and you have more foundational knowledge to figure out what exactly the magic was, it might end up not becoming something that's so off there and so occult or woo-woo. It just might end up becoming something extremely literal with more understanding.
Yep.
But if anybody wanted to come and contact you, possibly, if they've even had an experience in Michigan, or if you have any other work that you want people to come and follow, where can people come and find you on the internet?
Sure. I'd like to start off with MUFON. If anybody wants to report their sighting and have it investigated, there's no better place to do it than MUFON. You can do so at MUFON.com. If you happen to be in, let me start with this. So if you want to investigate UFOs, there's no better place to do it than MUFON.com. And you can find out the details there of how to actually investigate actual sightings that people report. In Michigan, we have a Michigan website, mimufon.org. And in that, it includes information about our local meetings that we have. We meet up on a regular basis in the warmer months in person, typically in Frankenmuth. We call it our Franken-MUFON meetings. And then we also have Zoom meetings. And one of the things that I always like to promote in September, the MUFON, the state MUFON organization, allies itself with a conference that happens in Houghton Lake, which is UFO Contact. And I think 2017 was the first year on that. And then it's still going strong. And you can find out information on that. MIUFOcon.com. for that. And just because I spoke so much about the abduction phenomena, there's a great lineup of speakers, but Deb Cobble, Peter Robbins are going to be there, and those people are iconic in the abduction community.
Well, I appreciate you making the time to come on today, and I'm really looking forward to next time. And as far as Michigan stuff goes, if you have any other weird cases that pop up, you'll definitely have to come back on the show and talk about it.
Oh, sure. Right on. Thanks for the invitation.
If anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can also get a hold of me through social media. Instagram and Facebook are the two that I'm the most active on. Or you guys can also get a hold of me through the submission form, which is up at the top of the link tree, and that will go directly to my email. And the last way you guys can get a hold of me is through the OMM hotline. You guys can text or call that 24/7, whatever's easier for you guys, and that number is 313-364-1551. And if you happen to miss that, it is available down in the show description, along with everything else that I have mentioned. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey. With the mic talking about foot.